Hello, friends. Warm greetings of today to all of you. I hope you all are doing excellent in your respective lives. I, Kunal Nagpal, once again welcome you all to this great economic forum. Today, friends, we are basically going to discuss the performance of the GDP, that is the gross domestic product for the Indian economy in the second quarter of the current financial year, that is 2022-23. Dear friends, the performance of the GDP of India has not been so encouraging in the second quarter, that is July to September 2022, thanks to a combination of factors. Though the double-digit growth of 13.5% was observed in the first quarter of 2022-23, but the economy grew at a slower pace of 6.3% in the second quarter. So, a lot of factors have been responsible for this performance. Firstly, weakening of the favorable base effect, that is, the statistical bump up on account of the low pandemic impacted GDP number of the comparable period last year. Secondly, worsening of the trade deficit. Thirdly, erosion of corporate profitability due to inflation. Presumably, this was offset by the continued stellar performance from the farm sector and high growth in the services sector, that is 9.3%, even as any hope of production to meet the festive induced demand of September to October 2022 was belied. And fourthly, manufacturing contracting an unexpected 4.3%. The last time manufacturing contracted, barring the 0.2% contraction in the fourth quarter of the last fiscal, was in the first quarter of 2020-21, during the peak of the pandemic when it contracted 31.5%. Clearly, this is something deeply amiss with the manufacturing sector, a point brought home independently by the core sector number growth prospects for the October 2022 month released just prior to the GDP numbers. At 0.1%, core sector, essentially infrastructure sectors like steel and cement growth is the lowest since January 2022. So, even though the overall growth number is in line with the RBI's forecast of 6.3% for the second quarter, all is far from well actually when it comes to the quality of the recovery, notably its sectoral composition. This is particularly worrisome since H2 2022-23 is likely to see a sharp reduction in growth due to the ongoing global economic slowdown. We know that the current global economy is going through a very gloomy phase. So with most of the West, barring the US, heading into recession, demand for India's exports is bound to be impacted adversely even as high inflation cramps domestic demand and in turn overall growth. So for now, hope is that we will end the year with the growth at 7.0% as estimated by the Reserve Bank of India in its September policy statement. Note, multilateral organizations like the International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, and the World Bank have lowered their estimates to 6.8% and 6.5% respectively, citing spillover from the war in Ukraine and global monetary tightening, both of which will inevitably impact investment thanks to increased uncertainty and higher financing costs. The good news is that the gross fixed capital formation, that is GFCF, a proxy for investment, has held up well. At 34.6% of the GDP in constant prices, it is only a bit lower than in the first quarter, that is 34.7%, suggesting the recovery will continue apace. So this is a sigh of relief. Much depends on how the Reserve Bank of India's Monetary Policy Committee, that is MPC, reads these numbers when it meets next week. Equally important, how the Government of India reads them. Remember, these will be the most recent and most detailed estimates available to the government other than the first advance estimates to be released on January 7, 2023 based on limited data while framing the budget. Will the Monetary Policy Committee read it as a recovery strong enough to justify a return to its ongoing battle against inflation, hence warranting continued tightening and at the same pace, that is 50 basis points, or in the past three meetings? Or read it as a signal that the economy, more correctly, some sections of the economy need support, and hence temper the rate hike to say 40 basis points. The latest inflation may give RBI some breathing space in its fight to contain inflation. Retail inflation based on the Consumer Price Index, that is CPI, moderated to 6.77% in October compared to 7.41% in September, while inflation on the Wholesale Price Index, that is WPI, declined as well to 8.4% in October, snapping an 18-month-long double-digit inflationary spell. So this is really commendable. However, as with the gross domestic product estimates, it is too early to pop the champagne. Inflation is notoriously difficult to rein in once it has gone out of hand, as it has in the Indian context. So, which is why the central banks across the world are not letting up on the fight against inflation, but are continuing to raise the interest rates despite clear evidence that higher interest rates are hurting growth and possibly resulting in recession. In the same vein, will the Government of India see the latest numbers as warranting further support from the fiscal? That is, temper the pace of fiscal consolidation by allowing a gentler pace of reduction of the fiscal deficit in the forthcoming budget? Or will it see it as suggesting that the recovery has taken root? Retail loan growth surged 20% in September, the fastest since the pandemic outbreak in 2020, unfazed by higher borrowing costs, signaling a robust revival in consumer demand, and stick to its earlier plan of returning to the fiscal roadmap under the much amended and oft breached Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, that is the FRBM Act. A November 2022 blog wherein the IMF economists Tobias Adrain and Walter Gasper argue that where inflation is high and persistent across the board, fiscal support is not called for. A smaller deficit cools aggregate demand and inflation. So, the central bank doesn't need to raise the rates as much. While the monetary policy has the tools to subdue inflation, fiscal policy can put the economy on a sounder long-term footing through investment in infrastructure and provision of the basic public services. So the policy mix matters, says the duo. The fiscal restraint will reduce the cost of bringing inflation back to the target in a timely way compared with the alternative of leaving the monetary policy alone to act. Here is hoping both the Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India read the numbers right and don't get lost in translation. So, this was today's session, which basically talked about the prospects of the GDP in the coming quarters or in the coming times. And we need to basically see whether the Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India act in correlation with each other, with proper coordination among them. So that's all for the day, dear guys. And I hope this session also would have contributed immensely to enhance your overall knowledge base regarding our economy. So thank you so much and see you next. So till then, take good care of yourselves. Namaskar. Jai Hind.